The faint hum of machinery filled the silence, a steady rhythm that pulsed in sync with her own heartbeat as Ayla's consciousness began to stir. Her eyelids fluttered, and her body felt impossibly heavy, her muscles stiff and unused. It was as if she were awakening from a century-long sleep. Slowly, the fog in her mind began to lift, revealing flickers of memory, blurred faces, fragments of voices, flashes of stars and planets. Then, the chill hit her, cold as ice and deep as space. Her breath clouded in front of her, and she became aware of the tight enclosure around her, like a steel womb. Panic rose as she realized she was trapped. She pressed her palms against the glass wall in front of her, feeling its smooth, unyielding surface. Her heart raced, and her breaths came faster, fogging up the glass with each exhale. She scanned the small control panel next to her, noticing her own name displayed on the screen. Ayla. The words were followed by numbers and symbols she couldn't immediately decipher, and then a message that read, "Cryogenic suspension cycle complete." She took in a deep breath, willing her trembling hands to steady. She was alive, but she had no idea where she was or why she had been placed in cryogenic stasis. Then, through the frosted glass, a figure appeared. Her first instinct was to recoil, but something inside her told her to stay calm. The figure, clad in what appeared to be an official uniform, looked at her with an unreadable expression. A series of electronic beeps sounded, and with a hiss, the glass door slid open. Cold air poured out, and Ayla gasped as she pulled herself free, her limbs feeling like lead weights. "Good, you're awake," the figure said, their voice neutral, bordering on cold. It was a man with a sharp jawline and piercing eyes that flicked over her with clinical detachment. "You were out for longer than we anticipated." Ayla tried to speak, but her voice came out as a hoarse whisper. Who are you?" The man looked at her, unfazed by her disorientation. "My name is Captain Ren Madsen. You were placed in stasis aboard this vessel for classified reasons." He hesitated for a moment, as if choosing his words carefully. "There's no easy way to say this, but you were frozen for the better part of a century." Ayla's mind reeled. A century. The weight of his words pressed down on her like the endless cold of space. Her entire world, her family, her friends, everything she had ever known, was likely gone, lost to time. Why? Her voice was weak, but the question came out as a demand. Why was I put in stasis? Captain Madsen crossed his arms, glancing at the screen beside her pod. "According to the data in your profile, you volunteered for a top-secret mission to explore a newly discovered threat, a phenomenon our scientists have since labeled as the Abyss, but your file is marked with restricted access, even to me. All I know is that we were ordered to keep you alive, preserved until now." Ayla's gaze sharpened. The Abyss. The name stirred something in her, a faint echo of fear and urgency. Bits and pieces of memories began to surface, briefings about a catastrophic force, an energy so destructive that it could annihilate entire planetary systems in seconds. She had been part of a team assembled to investigate it, and then she was here, awakening alone. She turned back to Captain Madsen, her voice steadier now. "Why wake me now? What's changed?" The captain's eyes darkened. "The Abyss has resurfaced. We lost communication with 3 colonies in the last month. Each one vanished. Not a trace left behind. And then, we intercepted a signal, a warning, from one of our Outer Rim outposts. They saw it coming, and they said it was unlike anything we've ever encountered. We've been assigned to investigate. Our superiors believe that you might be the only one who understands what we're up against." Ayla's stomach twisted. She wasn't ready for this. She didn't know if she could remember enough of her mission, of her training, to stop a threat she barely understood herself. But she knew one thing for certain. She was humanity's last hope against whatever lay beyond, lurking in the vast darkness. She took a deep, stabilizing breath, and squared her shoulders. "What's the plan?" Captain Madsen's expression softened slightly, an acknowledgement of her resolve. "We're heading to the edge of known space, where the last signal was received. It's a dangerous region, asteroid belts, spatial anomalies. But if there's anything left of the colonies, we'll find it." Ayla nodded, a strange calm settling over her. "And if we find the abyss?" Madsen hesitated, then looked at her with grim determination. "Then we survive. By any means necessary." Ayla glanced at the holographic panel on the wall, the stars in the display reflecting in her intense eyes. She felt an instinctive pull, as though something in the darkness called to her, beckoning her to uncover the secrets of the abyss and face the unknown. "Captain," she said, her voice firm, "I volunteered once to protect humanity. If there's still a fight to be fought, I'm ready." The captain nodded, a faint flicker of respect in his gaze. "Prepare yourself, Ayla. Whatever we find out there, it's like nothing the galaxy has seen before." As he turned to leave, Ayla allowed herself a moment to absorb the reality of her new life. She was a woman out of time, a soldier resurrected from the past, facing an enemy that had haunted her nightmares even before her century-long sleep. Her heart pounded with both fear and exhilaration, but she knew that this was her purpose. She would uncover the truth of the abyss, or she would die trying. Ayla's quarters on the Nova's edge were small and cold, filled with the hum of the ship's machinery and the faint vibration of engines pushing them through space. She sat on the narrow cot, her mind racing with fragments of memories, faces, names, laughter, the faces of people who were long dead. The hollow silence of knowing that everyone she had once loved was gone washed over her, but she pushed it away. She needed to focus. This mission was all she had now. The door slid open, and Captain Madsen entered, carrying a small tablet. "Ayla," he began, "I thought you might want a briefing on the abyss before we reach the colony. I can fill you in on what we've learned, but truthfully, it's not much." She nodded, her eyes sharp. "Anything will help." He sat across from her, tapping a few buttons on the tablet. A holographic image appeared between them, a swirling mass of dark energy, streaked with eerie blue light. Ayla felt a shiver run through her as she looked at it. The abyss looked alive, as though it were watching her. "Here's what we know," Madsen began, his voice low. "The abyss isn't just an anomaly. It's some kind of force. It emits waves of energy that cause extreme gravitational distortions, wiping out everything in its path. When it appeared a century ago, our scientists detected a strange frequency coming from it, almost like a signal, but we couldn't decipher it. We still can't." Ayla leaned forward, her mind piecing together the fragments she could remember. "I was part of a team investigating that signal. We theorized that the abyss wasn't just some natural phenomenon. It was intelligent, or at least controlled by something intelligent, but we had no idea what it was or where it came from. All we knew was that it was powerful enough to destroy entire star systems." Madsen nodded grimly. "And now it's back. If it's moving toward us, we need to find a way to stop it. But that's where you come in. The reports suggest you had some unique insight into the abyss. The higher-ups believe you might be the only one who can understand it." Ayla felt a flicker of doubt. She didn't remember much about the abyss, let alone any specific insight, but she couldn't let that stop her now. "I'll do whatever it takes to figure this out. Just tell me where we're heading." Madsen tapped the screen, and a map of the galaxy appeared, marking a small red dot near the outer rim. "We're en route to Outpost 12. A research station near the edge of the abyss's last known location. It was one of the last colonies to report strange phenomena before contact was lost. We believe the abyss might have targeted it directly." Ayla stared at the map, her heart racing. Outpost 12. The name sparked a faint memory, a vision of lab stations, researchers crowded around screens, voices tense and frightened. "I remember that outpost. My team used to send data there. If there's anything left, we might find clues about the abyss," Madsen's gaze was steady, his eyes dark. Then we'd better hope the outpost is still there when we arrive. Buckle up, Ayla. Things are about to get rough. The Nova's edge slipped into warp drive, stars stretching into long streaks of light as they hurtled toward Outpost 12. Ayla stayed in her quarters, reviewing whatever data she could find about the abyss, but most of it was fragmented, incomplete, as if someone had deliberately wiped records of its existence. A chime sounded from her door, and it slid open to reveal Madsen. "We're approaching the outpost," he said, his voice tense. "But we're picking up strange readings. There's something out there." Ayla followed him to the ship's bridge, where the crew was gathered around the main viewing screen. Outside, through the dark expanse of space, she saw it, the twisted remains of what had once been Outpost 12. The structures floated in pieces, shattered and hollow, drifting in a cloud of debris. Ayla's heart clenched at the sight. Hundreds of lives, gone in an instant. The lieutenant at the control panel looked up, his face pale. "Captain, we're detecting a signal. It's faint, but it's coming from one of the outpost's emergency beacons." Madsen turned to Ayla, his gaze grim. "This might be our only chance to gather data on what happened here. We'll dock with the outpost's remains and see if we can access any of its systems." The ship moved in closer, maneuvering through the floating debris until they docked with one of the only intact parts of the outpost, a research wing that had somehow survived the devastation. Ayla suited up with Madsen, slipping into a sleek exosuit that protected against the harsh environment of deep space. Together, they stepped into the airlock and then into the dark remains of Outpost 12. The inside of the outpost was eerily silent. Faint emergency lights flickered along the walls, casting long shadows. Pieces of equipment lay scattered across the floor, and every screen was either dark or blinking with static. Ayla fought back the surge of fear that rose in her chest. She was here to find answers, not to give in to fear. "This place looks like it's been shredded," Madsen murmured, his voice echoing through her helmet's comms. "It's what the abyss does," Ayla replied. "It distorts matter, almost like twisting it out of existence." She scanned the corridor, feeling the unsettling sensation that something was watching them. But there was only darkness. They reached the central lab, where a single console still glowed with faint power. Ayla approached it, her fingers hovering over the cracked surface as she activated the screen. Lines of code filled the display, fragments of a last transmission that had failed to send. Her heart raced as she read the message, piecing together the broken words. "The abyss, intelligence detected, life forms approaching. We are becoming." Ayla's blood ran cold. The message was incoherent, fractured by interference, but one word stood out: life forms. If this was true, then the abyss wasn't just an energy phenomenon. It was a vessel, or perhaps a weapon, carrying something alive, something that turned the abyss into a living force of destruction. Madsen looked over her shoulder, his eyes wide. "Becoming? What does that mean?" Ayla shook her head, her mind racing. "I don't know. But if the abyss is carrying life forms, then it's not just a threat to the galaxy. It's a species, or an army, capable of taking control of everything in its path." As she tried to extract the data from the console, a sudden tremor shook the outpost. Warning lights flashed, and a low, ominous hum filled the air. "Ayla, we need to get out of here!" Madsen yelled, grabbing her arm. They turned to run back to the docking hatch, but just as they reached the door, a wave of darkness flooded the corridor. It wasn't just the absence of light. It was a dense, impenetrable shadow that moved, almost as if it were alive. Ayla felt her heart seize as the darkness approached, bringing with it a feeling of overwhelming dread. "Captain, what is that?" she gasped, her voice trembling. Madsen's face was pale beneath his helmet. "That's the abyss. It's here." The darkness surged forward, filling every corner of the corridor, an entity that was both formless and yet somehow sentient. Ayla grabbed Madsen's arm, pulling him with her as they ran, but the darkness was faster, closing in around them. They barely made it to the docking hatch in time. Ayla threw herself through the airlock, slamming her hand on the emergency button to seal the door. The darkness pressed against the glass, swirling and pulsing, almost as if it were searching for a way inside. The hatch closed just as the Nova's edge detached from the outpost, pulling away from the darkness. Ayla and Madsen collapsed in the airlock, their breaths heavy with exhaustion and terror. But Ayla knew that they had only just escaped with their lives. The abyss was no longer just a threat from the past. It was a living, sentient force, and now it knew they were coming. She looked at Madsen, her eyes filled with both fear and determination. "We have to warn the galaxy. The abyss isn't just a phenomenon, it's a weapon, and whatever it's carrying, it's only just beginning." Back on board the Nova's edge, Ayla felt her entire body shaking as the ship put distance between itself and the ruined outpost. Captain Madsen was tense, his face set in grim lines as he relayed the emergency report to the command center of the Galactic Alliance. Every second felt like an eternity. They had faced the abyss up close, and Ayla knew they were lucky to be alive. Madsen turned to her, a flicker of unease in his eyes. "I've sent a high-priority distress signal to the Alliance. If they heed the warning, they'll start evacuating outposts near the abyss's trajectory. But if they ignore us—" Ayla nodded, her gaze hardening. She knew the Alliance well enough to expect skepticism. The abyss was a legend, a story lost to the archives, and she was a relic from the past, someone whose warnings could easily be dismissed as the ramblings of a woman out of time. She had one hope: to gather undeniable proof of what they'd seen, something that would force the Alliance to act. "Captain," she said, her voice steady, "we need to go back. The data from Outpost 12. There must be more in the remains of that facility. We need hard evidence of those life forms, something that will make the Alliance believe us." Madsen looked at her, as if weighing her resolve. "We barely escaped. If the abyss finds us again, we might not be so lucky. I understand the risk," Ayla replied. "But this darkness, this weapon, it's like nothing we've seen before. We need to understand it, or we'll be defenseless when it reaches populated space. I'll go back alone if I have to." After a long pause, Madsen's shoulders relaxed, and he nodded. "All right, but we're doing this carefully. No unnecessary risks. I'll alert the crew." 2 hours later, the Nova's edge re-entered the region of space around the shattered Outpost 12, cautiously navigating through the drifting debris. The ship's lights pierced the darkness, revealing twisted metal and the remains of equipment that had once been part of the outpost. Ayla was suited up, ready to embark on the most dangerous part of her mission yet. This time, they were bringing backup, a small squad of elite Marines, armed with high-tech pulse rifles and specially designed light grenades to ward off the abyss's shadows. The docking hatch opened, and Ayla led the team back into the wreckage of the outpost. She felt an ominous weight settle over her as she moved through the empty halls. The air was thick, filled with an almost tangible silence, as if the abyss itself were lurking in every shadow, watching them. They reached the central lab again, the broken console still flickering with its final desperate message. Ayla directed her attention to the other stations, hoping one of them still had data intact. She found a secondary console, its screen miraculously undamaged. With a deep breath, she activated it, and lines of encrypted data began to load. As the files downloaded to her tablet, a soldier beside her shifted nervously. "Ma'am, we're picking up some kind of energy fluctuation. It's coming from the edge of the outpost, moving in fast." Ayla's pulse quickened. She glanced at the screen, 92% loaded. "Hold tight, we're almost done," she whispered, watching the progress bar crawl forward. Suddenly, the room went dark. The emergency lights flickered once, twice, and then went out completely. A thick, inky blackness filled the room, suffocating, alive. It pressed against them from all sides, sending shivers down her spine. Stay calm, everyone. Madsen's voice crackled over the comms. Activate your light grenades. One by one, the Marines activated their devices, sending out bursts of harsh white light that momentarily pushed the shadows back. But the darkness only recoiled, swirling and shifting as if searching for weaknesses in their defenses. Ayla clenched her jaw, forcing herself to focus as the download completed. With a flick of her wrist, she disconnected the tablet, tucking it into her suit. We've got the data. Let's move. They turned to leave, but a thick tendril of shadow lashed out, wrapping around one of the soldiers and pulling him toward the darkness. He screamed, his light grenade falling to the floor and dimming as the abyss's presence overwhelmed it. "Help him!" Ayla shouted. But two more soldiers grabbed her, pulling her toward the exit as the shadows began to swarm, closing in on all sides. They stumbled through the corridors, the darkness licking at their heels, as if testing their strength. Ayla fired her weapon, a bright pulse of energy temporarily parting the shadows, but they quickly reformed, closing in with each step. By the time they reached the docking hatch, only 4 of them remained. They scrambled back onto the Nova's edge, slamming the airlock shut just as the darkness slammed into the glass, writhing and twisting, searching for a way in. The hatch sealed, and Ayla collapsed against the wall, breathing heavily as she looked at the remains of her team. The survivors were wide-eyed, shaken to the core, but alive. They had barely escaped, but they had the data, the proof they needed to convince the Alliance of the threat bearing down on them. Back on the bridge, Ayla inserted the tablet into the main console, and the recovered data flickered onto the screen. Images of twisted bodies, diagrams of organic and inorganic hybrid life forms, and finally, a single video file from the outpost's last transmission. The screen showed a scientist, his face pale, eyes wide with terror as he spoke in hurried tones. The abyss. It's not just consuming, it's transforming. Everything it touches is altered, repurposed. The darkness itself, it's alive, an intelligent force. We detected signals, no commands, broadcasted through the shadows. And they're coming for us. The video cut off abruptly, replaced by a black screen. The bridge was silent, each crew member processing the horror of what they had just witnessed. Madsen was the first to break the silence. We need to transmit this to the Alliance. They can't ignore this. Ayla nodded, her voice barely a whisper. This isn't just an enemy, Captain. The Abyss is a conqueror. It's erasing worlds, transforming everything in its path into something twisted, something obedient to its will. She looked out at the vast emptiness beyond the ship's viewing screen, imagining the countless stars and planets out there. Each one was a potential target, a future victim, and she knew that without immediate action, the Abyss would consume them all. Madsen initiated the transmission, sending the data along with a high-priority distress beacon to every major command center within the Alliance. The message was clear. An unstoppable force was on its way, and only immediate, united action could hope to stop it. Hours passed as they waited for a response. Ayla sat alone in the observation bay, staring out at the stars, feeling the weight of what was coming. She couldn't shake the feeling that the Abyss was somehow watching her, reaching out from the darkness, already aware of her existence. Finally, Madsen entered, his expression tense. We received a response. Ayla stood, bracing herself. And some of the colonies are mobilizing, preparing for evacuation, but the Central Alliance Command, they're hesitant. They think the Abyss might be contained if we focus on defense. They're refusing to launch an offensive. Ayla felt a surge of frustration. Defense won't be enough. The Abyss will adapt. It will find ways around any barriers we set up. We need to strike first, find its weakness before it reaches populated sectors. Madsen nodded. I agree. But without the Alliance's full support, we're limited. We need more intel. An actual encounter with the heart of the Abyss, something that shows its vulnerability. Ayla's eyes hardened. Then we go deeper. If the Alliance won't act, we find the abyss, and we take the fight to it. Madsen looked at her, admiration flickering in his gaze. You're willing to face it again? After everything we've seen? Ayla clenched her fists, her resolve unbreakable. If the abyss is alive, if it's intelligent, it must have a core, a source. I'll go to the ends of the galaxy to find it, and if I have to, I'll destroy it myself. Madsen nodded, his jaw set with determination. Then we gather the crew. We'll be the first line of defense, and if necessary, the last. As the Nova's Edge set its course for the abyss's last known coordinates, Ayla felt a mixture of fear and exhilaration. She was diving headfirst into darkness, a danger so immense it defied imagination, but she knew that this was her purpose, her chance to protect the galaxy from a fate worse than death. In the quiet hum of the ship, Ayla prepared herself for the journey ahead. The journey to the heart of the abyss took them deeper into uncharted space than Ayla had ever ventured before. The stars outside the Nova's Edge grew faint, swallowed by an oppressive darkness that seemed to pulse with its own heartbeat. It was as if the galaxy itself was retreating, recoiling from the menace they pursued. Ayla felt a chill that had nothing to do with the ship's temperature, a cold that crept into her bones and lingered there. Captain Madsen stood on the bridge, his gaze fixed on the vast emptiness before them. He had ordered the crew to their battle stations, and a heavy silence filled the air as everyone waited, tense and alert, for what lay ahead. Ayla joined him, her face steeled, her eyes focused. They both knew this mission was a gamble, one that could cost them their lives. "We're approaching the abyss's last known coordinates," Madsen murmured, his voice barely more than a whisper. Ayla nodded, her heart pounding. "Do we have any readings? Any sign of life?" Madsen shook his head. "Nothing but static. It's as if space itself is distorting. Our scanners can't make sense of it." Ayla clenched her jaw, frustration mingling with dread. The abyss was more than a physical entity. It was an anomaly, something that defied the very fabric of reality. She took a deep breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "We'll have to go in manually," she said, her voice firm. "Send a probe ahead. If the abyss is there, it'll respond." Madsen nodded and signaled to the lieutenant, who activated a small, sleek probe. The crew watched in tense silence as the probe detached from the ship, its lights blinking as it drifted into the darkness. The screens displayed the feed from the probe's camera, showing nothing but an endless void. The seconds dragged by, each one stretching into eternity. Then, suddenly, the darkness shifted. A low hum filled the bridge, growing louder as the probe's feed flickered, distorting. The shadows seemed to pulse, moving like thick smoke. And then, something emerged. Shapes, writhing and amorphous, took form in the darkness. At first, they were barely visible, mere shadows within shadows. But slowly, they coalesced into distinct figures, tall, lean, and vaguely humanoid, with eyes that glowed a cold, otherworldly blue. A murmur went through the crew. Ayla's hands clenched into fists as she stared at the screen, recognizing the entities she had feared since her awakening. The life forms within the abyss weren't just creatures. They were sentient. An army of shadows bound to the will of a single, malevolent force. One of the creatures turned, its gaze locking directly onto the probe, as if aware it was being watched. Its eyes flared, and the feed dissolved into static. The silence on the bridge was deafening. Madsen turned to Ayla, his face pale but determined. "That's our proof. The abyss isn't just a force of destruction. It's a civilization of beings that exist within and control the darkness." Ayla's mind raced. She had theories, ideas, but now she knew the abyss was a realm, inhabited by beings that had learned to manipulate space, to use darkness as both a weapon and a shield. These beings could pass through walls, distort matter, and consume everything in their path. She took a deep breath, turning to Madsen. "Captain, we need to find their core. If we can locate the central force controlling these entities, we might be able to destabilize it, destroy the heart, and the rest may fall. Madsen's expression was grim, but he nodded. Agreed, we'll move forward, but with caution. Everyone, stay alert. The ship moved deeper into the darkness, inch by inch, surrounded by the swirling shadows. The lights on the Nova's edge flickered as the abyss's presence grew stronger, each pulse of energy pressing against the ship as if testing its defenses. Ayla could feel the oppressive weight pressing against her mind, a subtle, insidious influence that whispered of despair, of surrender. Suddenly, the ship jolted, throwing her against the wall. Alarms blared, and red lights bathed the bridge as the crew scrambled to regain control. "Captain, we're caught in some kind of gravitational field," a crew member shouted. "It's pulling us in." Madsen's eyes widened. "Reverse thrusters! Get us out of here!" The engines roared, straining against the pull, but the ship continued to be dragged forward, deeper into the abyss. The darkness outside intensified, pressing against the hull, almost as if it were alive, seeking to swallow them whole. Ayla gripped the railing, her mind racing. "We can't fight it directly. The abyss is drawing us toward its core. If we keep resisting, we'll tear the ship apart." Madsen looked at her, understanding dawning in his eyes. "So we go with it. We let it take us in." Ayla nodded, her heart pounding. "Exactly. We use the abyss's pull to get us closer, then strike when we're at the core." Madsen turned to the crew, his voice calm and steady. "You heard her. Stand down the engines. Let the abyss guide us." The ship went silent as the thrusters powered down, and they drifted forward, carried by the abyss's relentless force. The bridge was tense, every crew member silent, watching as the darkness around them grew denser, suffocating. The shadows pressed against the windows, writhing and swirling, as if hungry for their presence. Then, through the blackness, they saw it. A massive structure, faintly illuminated by a pulsing, sinister light. It was the heart of the abyss, a towering mass of dark energy and twisted architecture, like a city built from shadows. The structures were jagged, organic, as if grown rather than constructed, and at the center was a single, blinding light, a core that pulsed with a rhythm like a heartbeat. Ayla stared in awe and horror. This was it, the heart of the abyss, the source of its power. "We're here," Madsen said quietly. "Now what?" Ayla's gaze was steely. "We send in an energy charge, powerful enough to disrupt the core. If we're right, it'll destabilize the entire structure." Madsen nodded, signaling to the weapons officer. "Prepare the charge. Set it to detonate on my command." The crew worked quickly, loading the energy charge and aligning it with the ship's targeting systems. Ayla's heart raced as she watched the screen, her mind focused on the task at hand. This was their one shot. If they failed, the abyss would consume them and the galaxy with no opposition. "Charge ready, Captain," the weapons officer reported. Madsen turned to Ayla, giving her a nod. She took a deep breath, her eyes fixed on the core. "Fire," she whispered. The charge launched from the ship, a brilliant beam of energy slicing through the darkness as it hurtled toward the core. For a heartbeat, nothing happened. Then the charge struck and the core flared, a blinding light that lit up the entire structure. The heart of the abyss began to tremble, cracks of light splitting through the dark architecture. The shadows around them writhed and screamed, a sound that filled Ayla's mind with an indescribable terror, as if 1,000 voices were crying out in agony. "It's working!" she shouted, her voice filled with both fear and exhilaration. But then, just as quickly, the core pulsed again. This time, with renewed strength, the cracks in the structure began to close, the light dimming as the darkness reformed, healing itself. "No," Ayla breathed, horror filling her as the abyss's core repaired itself. The darkness surged, its wrath palpable, and the gravitational pull intensified, drawing them closer. The crew struggled as the ship buckled under the pressure. Madsen's face was tense, his voice hoarse as he called out orders. "We need to get out of here! Full power to the thrusters!" But Ayla knew it was too late. The abyss was retaliating, tightening its grip, refusing to let them escape. Desperation gripped her. But then she remembered something, a faint memory, a piece of knowledge she hadn't known she retained. "The signal," she murmured. "The abyss uses a signal to control the shadows. If we can disrupt it—" She turned to Madsen, her eyes blazing. "Captain, if we can generate a countersignal, it might destabilize the core long enough for us to escape." Madsen nodded, catching on. "How do we generate it?" Ayla took a deep breath. "We use the ship's communications array, set to resonate at the abyss's frequency, but inverted. It'll take every bit of power we have." Madsen didn't hesitate. "Do it." The crew scrambled to set the ship's array to the correct frequency, rerouting all power to the communications system. Ayla watched the screens, her heart pounding as the ship hummed with energy, the counter-signal building in intensity. "Now!" she shouted. The ship unleashed the signal, a piercing wave that pulsed through the darkness. The abyss shuddered, the shadows twisting and thrashing as the core destabilized. The light within the heart of the abyss began to flicker, the structures cracking as the counter-signal tore through it. "Reverse thrusters! Get us out of here!" Madsen ordered. The Nova's edge powered away from the core, the abyss writhing and collapsing in on itself as the counter-signal disrupted its structure. The shadows reached for them, desperate, clinging to the last remnants of their existence. But the ship broke free, speeding into the void. As they put distance between themselves and the abyss, the crew let out a collective breath of relief. Ayla collapsed into her seat, exhaustion washing over her as she watched the abyss shrink into the distance, its heart a dying ember. But she knew this wasn't over. The abyss was wounded, but it would heal, rebuild, and adapt. They had only bought themselves time. Back aboard the Nova's edge, the atmosphere was tense yet subdued. Ayla and Captain Madsen had faced the abyss, witnessed its sentient darkness, and felt the unrelenting pull of its core. The crew had barely escaped, but their temporary victory was overshadowed by the realization that the abyss was not gone. It was only dormant, waiting to resurge with even greater strength. Ayla sat in the ship's briefing room, her hands trembling slightly as she went over the data from their encounter. Despite their counter-signal strategy, the abyss had begun to reassemble itself almost immediately. It was like a wounded predator retreating to recover before it struck again. Madsen entered the room, his face set in grim lines. "We're transmitting our findings to the Alliance Command now. With the evidence we've gathered, they won't be able to ignore us this time." Ayla nodded, though a part of her remained doubtful. She knew how bureaucracies worked, how the Alliance, with its vast network of governments and factions, could be slow to respond to emerging threats. "We need to make them understand that this isn't just a localized problem," she said, her voice firm. "The abyss won't stop until it's consumed everything in its path. It's like a virus, evolving with every encounter, finding new ways to bypass our defenses." Madsen sighed. "We've done everything we can. Now we wait for their response." "But, Ayla, we both know they may not act fast enough. The transmission took hours to reach the Alliance Command Center." Ayla and the crew gathered on the bridge, tense and silent, as they awaited a response. Finally, a notification beeped, and an image appeared on the main screen, an Alliance officer in formal attire, her expression stony as she addressed the crew of the Nova's Edge. "This is Commander Sloan of the Alliance Council. Captain Madsen, we've reviewed your report on the abyss. While your findings are alarming, we must proceed with caution. Mobilizing a fleet against an unknown entity risks further destabilizing the outer sectors." Ayla felt anger flare within her. "With all due respect, Commander, the abyss is not an isolated threat. It's a force capable of annihilating entire colonies in seconds. We can't afford to wait until it's at our doorstep." Commander Sloan's gaze flicked to Ayla, her eyes cold. "And who are you, exactly?" "Ayla," Madsen interjected. "She's an expert on the abyss. She volunteered for cryogenic preservation a century ago to study the phenomenon. The commander's expression shifted to one of wary curiosity. A relic from the past, she murmured. How poetic. Ayla fought to keep her voice steady. The abyss isn't just a curiosity from history, Commander. It's alive, it's intelligent, and it's evolving. You saw the evidence we transmitted. These creatures within the abyss, they're not just mindless shadows. They are soldiers, bound to a greater will. Commander Sloan hesitated, and Ayla could see the conflict in her eyes. She wanted to dismiss the threat, to contain it as something beyond the Alliance's immediate jurisdiction. But Ayla knew that if they waited too long, the abyss would consume more worlds, gaining strength with every conquest. Finally, Sloan spoke. We'll establish a blockade around the outer sectors, fortifying nearby colonies. But a full-scale assault on the abyss is premature. Without understanding its vulnerabilities, we risk losing thousands of lives. Ayla clenched her fists. And if the blockade fails, if the abyss adapts, as it has every time we've encountered it? Sloane's gaze hardened. Then we'll reconsider our approach. But until then, you are to remain on standby. Do not engage with the abyss unless ordered otherwise. The screen went dark, and Ayla felt a mixture of frustration and despair. They had brought the Alliance undeniable proof, risked their lives to gather intel, and still, the response was cautious, bureaucratic, slow. Masson placed a hand on her shoulder. Ayla, we did everything we could. Now, all we can do is prepare ourselves. If the Alliance won't strike, then we'll be ready when the abyss comes to us. She nodded, but her heart was heavy. Waiting was a death sentence. She knew that the abyss would not wait for the Alliance to make up its mind. A few days later, the Nova's Edge remained stationed near the Alliance's makeshift blockade, a ring of ships forming a fragile barrier between inhabited space and the abyss. Ayla's anxiety grew each day, her frustration bubbling as she watched the blockade crews settle into their positions, going about their duties with the casual confidence of those who had never faced the abyss firsthand. Her tablet buzzed with a message from Madsen, requesting her presence in the strategy room. She hurried down the corridor, her heart pounding with a mixture of dread and anticipation. Perhaps the Alliance had finally come to its senses, but when she arrived, Madsen's expression was grim. We've detected unusual readings from the edge of the abyss. Small fluctuations in energy, too faint to set off alarms, but it's there. It's active. Ayla's breath caught. It's testing the blockade. It's watching us, analyzing our defenses. Madsen nodded. That's my guess, too. The abyss is probing, searching for weaknesses. It's only a matter of time before it strikes. He looked at her, his eyes dark and intense. We can't wait for the Alliance's permission. We need to act. Ayla felt a rush of adrenaline. What are you suggesting? Madsen hesitated, then spoke with a steely resolve. A small team, just you and me. We'll take a stealth craft and head back to the core of the abyss. If we can reach the center, maybe we can plant a device, something that could destabilize it from within. Ayla's mind raced. It was a suicide mission, a reckless gamble. But it was their only shot. How long do we have? Not long. We'll take one of the covert shuttles. The crew here will hold the line in case anything goes wrong. Without another word, Ayla and Madsen suited up, gathering what gear they could carry, a destabilizer charge, a handful of energy cells, and a single, untested device the scientists on the Nova's Edge had created, a prototype meant to disrupt electromagnetic fields on a massive scale. If they could reach the abyss's core, the device might, just might, disrupt the dark energy that fueled it. The shuttle glided silently through the blockade, disappearing into the darkness as it approached the abyss. Ayla felt a familiar chill settle over her as the shadows closed in, thicker and darker than ever before. It was as if the abyss sensed their approach, as if it were waiting. Madsen piloted the shuttle with precision, guiding them through the dense field of darkness toward the core they had glimpsed before. The silence was oppressive, the darkness pressing against the shuttle's windows like a living thing. Finally, they reached the edge of the core. The pulsing heart of the abyss loomed before them, surrounded by writhing shadows that moved with purpose, like sentinels guarding a fortress. Ayla felt the weight of its malevolent gaze, as if the abyss itself were studying them, recognizing them. Madsen turned to her, his face set with determination. "This is it. We plant the device and get out." They exited the shuttle in their exosuits, tethered together as they drifted toward the core. Ayla clutched the destabilizer charge, her eyes fixed on the pulsing light. The core was beautiful, hypnotic, an ever-shifting mass of dark energy shot through with streaks of brilliant blue. It almost seemed alive, breathing, watching them. As they approached, the shadows thickened, coiling around them like tendrils, testing their defenses. Ayla activated her light emitter, pushing back the darkness long enough for her to attach the destabilizer to the core's surface. "Hurry," Madsen urged, glancing warily at the encroaching shadows. With a final click, Ayla armed the device, setting the timer for a short delay. They turned to retreat, but the shadows surged, lashing out in fury, surrounding them with a force that was both physical and mental. Ayla felt a wave of despair wash over her, a voice whispering in her mind, urging her to surrender, to join the darkness. "Don't listen!" Madsen shouted, his voice cutting through the oppressive influence. "Keep moving!" They struggled back to the shuttle, fighting every step of the way as the abyss fought to pull them into its depths. Ayla's vision blurred, her limbs heavy, but she forced herself onward, fueled by sheer willpower. They stumbled into the shuttle, slamming the hatch shut just as the device's timer reached 0. Through the window, Ayla saw a burst of light as the destabilizer detonated, sending shockwaves through the core. The abyss convulsed, its shadows thrashing wildly, the core flickering as it struggled to maintain cohesion. Ayla felt a surge of hope. Perhaps they had done it. Perhaps they had wounded the beast. But then, as quickly as it had faltered, the core stabilized, the shadows reforming with renewed vigor. The abyss wasn't just healing, it was adapting, learning from the attack, growing stronger. Madsen's face was pale as he turned to her. "We need to warn the blockade. This thing, it's more powerful than we thought." As they powered up the shuttle, Ayla felt a cold certainty settle over her. They hadn't stopped the abyss, they had only angered it, and now it would come for them all. The Nova's Edge and its Alliance blockade crew were on high alert as the shuttle raced back from the heart of the abyss. Ayla's heart pounded as she watched the distant lights of the blockade ships grow brighter, each one a fragile point of defense against the dark tide gathering just beyond their sensors. Madsen's face was set in grim determination. "We've bought ourselves a little time, but not much. The abyss won't hold back now. Whatever consciousness controls it, it knows we're here, and it's coming." As the shuttle docked, Ayla and Madsen practically ran through the corridors to the Nova's Edge's command center, where Commander Sloane's transmission awaited them. Her expression tense. "Ayla, Captain Madsen," Sloane greeted them, her voice strained. "The readings coming from your coordinates are alarming. Reports are coming in from multiple sectors. It's like a wave spreading out from the abyss." Ayla stepped forward, her voice steady but filled with urgency. "Commander, the abyss is a sentient entity, and it's evolving every time we make contact. It's adapting to our attacks. We need to strike at full force now, or we'll lose any chance to stop it." Sloane hesitated, her face clouded with doubt. "The Alliance is reluctant to commit to an offensive without concrete proof that we can stop it. We can't risk countless lives on an untested strategy." Ayla's fists clenched. She took a deep breath, fighting back her frustration. "With all due respect, Commander, waiting will cost more lives. We may not have concrete proof, but we've gathered enough data to know that this is our only chance." Madsen placed a hand on Ayla's shoulder, nodding to Sloane. "Commander, if we focus our forces on a single, concentrated assault, we might disrupt its core long enough to deliver a killing blow. We just need a window, a few seconds. I believe that's all it will take." Sloane's expression softened slightly, as if sensing the desperation in their voices. She looked at them for a long moment, then gave a single, reluctant nod. "All right," she said quietly. "I'll authorize a full offensive, but you two will lead the charge. This is your fight. You understand the Abyss better than anyone." Ayla and Madsen exchanged a glance. This was it, their one chance to make a stand. Within hours, the Alliance blockade had transformed into a massive fleet, ships from dozens of sectors rallying together. The vast array of vessels hung in space, their sleek, metallic hulls gleaming against the backdrop of endless darkness. Ayla stood on the bridge of the Nova's edge, gazing out at the gathered armada, each ship carrying hundreds of lives, all of them relying on her. Captain Madsen approached her, his voice low. "You ready?" Ayla nodded, steeling herself. "Ready as I'll ever be." She took her place at the command station, watching the tactical display light up with hundreds of signals as each ship prepared for battle. A low hum filled the bridge as the crew activated every defensive and offensive system at their disposal, arming torpedoes, priming energy cannons, and readying EMP pulses to disrupt the Abyss's gravitational pull. Then, the Abyss began to move. On the screen, the dark mass shifted, spreading outward, the shadows coalescing into a dense wave that moved with terrifying speed. Ayla could feel it, a presence, vast and ancient, a mind filled with rage and hunger, directing the shadows toward the fleet like a swarm of locusts. "Here it comes," Madsen murmured, his voice tight. "Engage all weapons," Ayla commanded, her voice steady. "Focus fire on the leading edge of the Abyss. Don't let it break through the front line." The Alliance fleet opened fire, a brilliant storm of light and energy hurtling toward the approaching darkness. The explosions illuminated the Abyss, briefly revealing the twisted forms of the shadow creatures within it, glimpses of ghostly figures with hollow eyes, their bodies writhing as they absorbed the impact. The darkness recoiled, but only for a moment before surging forward, undeterred. Ayla's heart raced. "Prepare the counter signal. We'll broadcast on all frequencies when the Abyss reaches the halfway point." Madsen relayed the order, and the crew scrambled to activate the signal generator, tuning it to the frequency they'd used in their last encounter with the core. It was a risky maneuver. If the Abyss had adapted to their signal, it could render their only defense useless. The shadows closed in, lashing out at the first line of Alliance ships. Ayla watched in horror as several vessels were engulfed, their lights flickering before disappearing into the blackness. The Abyss was relentless, each attack methodically calculated, as if testing the fleet's defenses, pushing them closer to breaking. "Now!" Ayla shouted. "Broadcast the counter signal!" The Nova's edge unleashed a piercing wave of sound, a frequency that resonated across the fleet, creating a field of light that held the shadows at bay. The Abyss faltered, the darkness shuddering as the signal cut through it, disrupting its cohesion. For a moment, hope surged through Ayla, but then the Abyss began to pulse, its shadows swirling faster, fighting against the signal with a ferocity that sent shockwaves through the ship. Ayla watched as the shadows mutated, splitting and reforming, adapting to the frequency. "It's resisting!" Madsen shouted. "We're losing our hold!" Ayla's mind raced. They needed something more, something powerful enough to pierce the heart of the Abyss and deliver a fatal blow. She remembered the prototype device the scientists had developed, a weapon designed to overload energy fields. It was experimental, unstable, but it was their last chance. "Captain," she said, her voice steady but intense, "we need to launch the EMP core. If we can get it close enough to the heart of the Abyss, we might be able to destabilize it permanently." Madsen hesitated, his eyes filled with both doubt and trust. "If we fail, this entire fleet—" Ayla met his gaze, her eyes resolute. "If we don't try, we're all lost anyway." He nodded. "Let's do it." Ayla relayed the plan to the fleet, calling for every available ship to converge on the Abyss and form a shield around the Nova's edge as it carried the EMP core. One by one, The Alliance ships moved into formation, their captains willing to sacrifice their vessels, their lives, for a final, desperate chance at victory. With the fleet covering their approach, Ayla and Madsen guided the Nova's edge into the heart of the abyss, the shadows pressing against the hull as if trying to suffocate them. The ship buckled under the strain, but Ayla focused on the core, on the pulsing light at the center of the darkness. They launched the EMP core, watching as it drifted through the shadows, a small, fragile beacon of hope against an endless void. Ayla held her breath as the device reached the center, watching as the core pulsed one last time. Then, with a blinding flash, the EMP detonated. A wave of energy erupted from the core, spreading outward in a shockwave that tore through the abyss. The shadows screamed, a sound that filled the void with an unearthly agony, as if the abyss itself were dying. The dark mass began to collapse, its tendrils disintegrating as the energy wave consumed it, leaving only fading wisps of darkness in its wake. On the bridge, Ayla felt the pressure lift, the oppressive weight of the abyss finally dissipating. She looked around at the exhausted but victorious crew, a mixture of relief and disbelief in their eyes. It's gone, Madsen whispered, his voice barely more than a breath. Ayla nodded, feeling a wave of exhaustion wash over her. The abyss, the ancient threat that had haunted her nightmares, was finally defeated. But as she looked out at the wreckage, at the remains of the ships and lives lost in the battle, she knew that the cost had been immense. In the days that followed, the Alliance fleet regrouped, tending to the wounded and honoring those who had fallen. Ayla and Madsen returned to Alliance headquarters, where they were hailed as heroes, though the victory felt hollow. They had won, but the scars of the battle would remain, a reminder of the darkness they had faced and the fragile peace they had fought to protect. As Ayla stood on the observation deck, gazing out at the stars, Madsen joined her, his expression contemplative. "We did it," he said quietly. "We stopped the abyss." Ayla nodded, but her gaze was distant. "For now. But there are always more threats, more shadows waiting in the dark, and we'll have to be ready." Madsen placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Then we'll face them, together." Ayla smiled, a flicker of hope sparking in her heart. She had been pulled from the past, thrust into a future filled with unknown dangers, but she was no longer alone. She had allies, friends, and a purpose, a reason to keep fighting. As the stars twinkled in the endless night, Ayla knew that whatever came next, she would be ready for the galaxy, for those she had lost, and for the future they had all fought to protect.